Wren Ashford had always known how to disappear into her work. In the border village of Ashwick, where the healer's hut smelled of crushed herbs and boiled linen, she spent her days stitching wounds and easing fevers, far from the marble halls of the capital. She never wanted the attention of the royal court. But the night she saved the life of a dying sentinel, with nothing but her bare hands and a strange, quiet gift for sensing pain before it bloomed into death, attention found her anyway. Word travels fast among wolves. Within a week, a royal escort arrived at her door, sent by the Alpha King himself. She was to be honored at court for her gift. She did not want to go, but refusing a summons from the king was not something anyone in Valemore did lightly, so she packed a small bag and left the only home she had ever known. The capital was unlike anything Wren had imagined. Towers of pale stone rose against the mountains, and the air itself seemed to hum with the presence of hundreds of wolves gathered under one roof. She felt small walking through the grand hall, her worn healer's cloak out of place among the silks and polished armor of the court. Then she saw him. King Cade Direwolf stood at the head of the hall, tall and still, his eyes the color of storm clouds before rain. He was said to be the strongest alpha in 3 generations, a man who had led his people through famine and war without once faltering. But when his gaze met Wren's, something in his composure shifted, just slightly, like a held breath. The ceremony began. Cade spoke of her courage, of the sentinel she had saved, of the honor she had brought to her small village. Wren listened, uncomfortable beneath the weight of so many eyes. Then, without warning, the king stepped forward and reached for her hand, intending to place the Alpha's mark upon her wrist, a bond that would tie her to him and to the crown forever. Wren pulled her hand back. The hall fell silent. No one refused the Alpha King. It simply was not done, but Wren stood her ground, her heart pounding, and said the words that would ripple through every wolf clan in Valemore by morning. "I will not be claimed like property, Your Majesty, not even by a king." Cade's jaw tightened, but he did not raise his voice. He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, then nodded once and stepped back. She was allowed to leave the capital that same night, unharmed and unmarked, though whispers followed her all the way home. Wren tried to return to her old life. She healed the sick, tended the wounded, and told herself the king would forget her, that a man with an entire kingdom to rule had no reason to think twice about a healer who had embarrassed him in front of his court. But 2 months later, when war drums began to sound in the north, another royal messenger arrived at her door. The Northern Pack, led by a rival alpha named Ronan Blackthorn, had grown bold, testing the borders of Valemore with raids and skirmishes. The wounded were pouring into the capital faster than the royal healers could treat them. Wren was needed, not as an honored guest this time, but as someone whose skill could save lives. She went, not for the king, but for the soldiers who would die without help. The castle she returned to was a different place than the one she remembered. Gone were the silks and polished floors of the ceremony hall. In their place were cots lined with injured wolves, the air thick with the smell of blood and burning herbs. Wren worked without rest, moving from bed to bed, using every ounce of her gift to hold death at bay. It was there, in the middle of exhaustion and grief, that she saw Cade again. He was not dressed as a king that night. He wore a simple tunic, his hands stained from carrying wounded soldiers himself, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep. He worked beside his people instead of above them, and Wren found herself watching him with something she did not want to name. Late one night, after the worst of the wounded had been stabilized, Cade found her sitting alone outside the infirmary, staring up at a sky full of stars. He sat beside her without asking, and for a while neither of them spoke. "You saved 12 lives today," he said finally. "I lost 3, she answered. "You saved 12, he repeated, gently but firmly. She turned to look at him, surprised by the softness in his voice. This was not the commanding Alpha King from the ceremony hall. This was a man carrying the weight of a war he never wanted, doing everything he could to protect his people. "I want to offer you the mark again," he said quietly. "Not as a king claiming a healer. As a man who cannot stop thinking about you." Wren's chest tightened. Part of her wanted to say yes, to let herself be claimed by someone who saw her, truly saw her, not just her gift. But the fear that lived deep inside her rose up just as quickly. "I can't," she whispered. "Why not?" he asked. Not with anger, but with genuine confusion. She told him then, the truth she had never spoken aloud to anyone. Her mother had been marked by a mate who died in battle only a year later, and something in her mother had died with him. She became a shadow of herself, unable to feel joy, unable to fully live, tethered forever to a bond that had been broken by death. Ren had watched her waste away for years, and she had promised herself she would never let herself be erased that way. "I don't want to lose myself," she said, "even for someone like you." Cade did not argue with her. He simply nodded, his expression heavy with understanding rather than rejection, and let the silence settle between them once more. When he left her that night, there was no anger in his steps, only a quiet ache that mirrored her own. The war grew worse before it grew better. Ronan Blackthorn's forces pushed deeper into Valemor's territory, burning villages and cutting off supply lines. Cade led his warriors into battle time and again, refusing to let his people fight without him. Ren stayed behind the front lines, treating the wounded as they were carried in, praying every day that the king's name would not be among them. Then one evening, it was. Cade was brought in on a stretcher, his body torn open by wounds far beyond what any ordinary healer could mend. The royal physicians worked frantically, but Ren could see it in his fading pulse, in the way his pain signature grew fainter beneath her gift. He was dying, and there was nothing conventional medicine could do to stop it. There was one option left. Ren's gift, at its full strength, could bind her own life force to his, drawing him back from the edge of death by tying her essence to what remained of his. But such a bond was permanent. It was, in every way that mattered, the same as the Alpha's mark, perhaps even stronger, because it would be forged not through ceremony, but through sacrifice. She stood over him, her hands trembling, torn between the fear that had shaped her entire life and the growing ache in her heart that told her this man was worth saving, no matter the cost. She thought of her mother, hollowed out by loss. She thought of her own promise to never let herself disappear into someone else's fate. But then she thought of Cade sitting beside her under the stars, offering himself not as a king, but as a man who saw her as an equal. She thought of the 12 lives she had saved, and the countless more he had fought to protect. She realized, in that moment, that her fear had never truly been about losing herself to a bond. It had been about never choosing anyone at all, about staying safe by staying alone. This time, there was no one asking her to accept a mark. There was no ceremony, no crown, no expectation. There was only her own hands, her own choice, and a man who might die without her. She chose him. Placing her palms against his chest, Ren poured every ounce of her strength into the bond, calling her life force to twine with his fading pulse. Pain seared through her own body as the connection took hold, but she did not let go. She held on through the burning, through the exhaustion, through the fear, until she felt his heartbeat steady beneath her hands. When Cade opened his eyes hours later, the first thing he saw was Ren, pale and trembling but alive, sitting beside him. On both their wrists, a mark had formed, not by his will, but by hers. "You saved me," he whispered. "I chose to," she answered. In the weeks that followed, as Cade recovered and the war finally began to turn in Valemor's favor, something extraordinary became clear. The bond between them was unlike any mark recorded in the kingdom's long history. Rather than draining Ren's strength the way forced marks were known to weaken a mate's spirit, her gift grew stronger, sharper, more attuned than ever before. Scholars in the royal archives, poring over ancient texts, uncovered the truth behind a prophecy that had been misunderstood for generations. The old writings had long been interpreted as a warning that any Alpha King who marked an unwilling mate would bring ruin upon his people. But the true meaning, buried in older language and half-forgotten symbols, was something else entirely. The prophecy promised that the first mate to accept the mark freely, by her own choice and not by claim or command, would forever change the laws of every wolf clan in the land. Cade, humbled by what Ren had done for him, and moved by the truth the scholars had uncovered, called together the leaders of every pack in Valemor. Before them all, he abolished the ancient tradition of forced marking, declaring that from that day forward, No wolf would ever again be claimed against their will. Bonds would be built on choice, not birthright. Trust, not command. The change did not happen overnight. Old customs rarely do. But slowly, pack by pack, the new law took root. Wolves who had once been bound by duty or fear began choosing their mates freely, and something in the very spirit of the kingdom seemed to soften, to heal, in ways that mirrored Ren's own gift. Ren never forgot her mother, nor the fear that had shaped so much of her life. But she came to understand that the mark she now carried was nothing like the one that had hollowed her mother out. Hers had been given freely, chosen in a moment of courage rather than command, and because of that, it made her stronger rather than smaller. Months later, standing before the unified clans of Valemore on the day of their wedding, Ren looked out at a crowd unlike any that had gathered before. Mates standing beside mates not because tradition demanded it, but because they had chosen one another. Beside her, Cade took her hand, the same hand he had once reached for in a ceremony hall full of strangers, and this time, she did not pull away. The girl who had refused the Alpha King twice had, in the end, changed the future of every wolf alive, not by finally submitting to his claim, but by teaching an entire kingdom the difference between being taken and being chosen. And as the wolves of Valemore threw back their heads in a common howl to celebrate the twice-refused, finally accepted bond, Ren understood at last that she had never lost herself in that choice. She had found herself in it.